Good afternoon, David, and thank you very much for joining us here at the Mint to talk about your book, Money.
Henry, I am delighted. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor. Thank you very much for having me on the Mint.
Brilliant. And so if you could start by, telling me a bit about your inspiration for making the big effort to write a book, which is always a hell of a thing, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. It is. I always advise potential authors who say, well, maybe, particularly in Ireland, everybody says, I have a book in me, and everyone in the pub has a book in them. And sometimes, given that this is my sixth book, sometimes I say to them, look, guys, this is not for the faint-hearted. It is a long, long, laborious slog. It's for much more perspiration than inspiration. But if you have the capacity for that, it's a great thing to do. And this particular book, which thankfully is selling very, very well and people seem to like it, the idea came, I think, bizarrely, Henry, from a kind of a wake-up moment. I have been a monetary economist, former central banker, investment banker, then commentator, journalist, all that sort of stuff for, 30 years. And I had this sort of eureka moment that maybe the story of money that economists have been telling, and my tribe has been telling for many, many years, doesn't really quite grasp the essential nature of money. So by that I mean, you work in a central bank. I worked in the Irish Central Bank when we had our own currency. So consequently, we did, in fact, invent the money there. We made it up and pumped it into the economy via the banking system. But economists were always very good at telling you how, for example, money gets around the system. The same way as a plumber would be very good at telling you how water gets around the house. But if you sit the plumber down for a cup of tea and you say, well, why do you think water is essential for life? Most plumbers, I'd say, would say, well, look, that's not my neck of the woods. And I think the same thing as economists. We have refused to engage with the big idea of what is money? What does it do to humanity? Where is the relationship between money and humanity? What exactly is it? So as a result of that, I kind of alighted on this notion that money is an amazing technology. And once you begin to look at money as a social technology, then you can look at the origins of money as a sort of almost a social requirement for complex societies. And that was it was a leap in the dark, Henry. It was a notion, like all, I think, ideas then with like, maybe this will work. And then when you actually go back and start to look at the history of money, the story of money, then you realize, in fact, this is precisely what it is. And I suppose it's that very ephemeral nature of the definition, which maybe causes our profession not to engage with it in the way it should be. So the book has got lots of anthropology, lots of biology, lots of history, lots of obviously finance, monetary economics in it as well. But as you said at the top there, it also has a lot of stories because the characters who are involved in the story of money are fascinating because humans are fascinating. So that was the big idea. And I was probably aided, Henry, by the fact that we had a pandemic smack in the middle. And I was stuck in the basement for the best part of, we were probably stuck for about a year and a half, more or less, on and off. And that allowed me to do a lot of the research, which was great fun.
Well, I'm glad to hear you made good use of that time. So, yes, I mean, the history and exactly what money is, I think, is a fascinating question. And often, I think a lot of people don't really understand. And obviously, it's hugely debated. So I want to go back to the beginning of the history, because you sort of start, obviously, with the story of money as a sort of IOU.
Yes. Yes.
Which is the classic, as you obviously see in a banknote, I will pay the bearer of this and so forth. Then the next bit you go to, if you like, the invention of coins.
Yes. Yes.
And this is the tricky bit for me because an IOU clearly seems to be a social technology. But then suddenly we get into the world of coins and people digging up silver and digging up gold and going up to get more of the gold. And it's like suddenly money seems more like a thing and there's more of it. You grab more of it and so forth. And you wonder, well, has it changed or is this a misunderstanding of what's going on in a way? But
Or maybe it's just a crucial innovation in the notion of money. So I start with the basic idea. If you look at history, we find the first evidence, what we think is the evidence of organized trade and consequently money and people having something that looked like a tally stick in, amazingly, about 20,000 years ago in the Congo Basin. In 1952, Belgian archaeologists found, and I'm doing this because I went to Belgium to look at this thing, a baboon's femur, very shrunk now because it's so old. And on this femur, they found notches. It's called the Ishango bone. And the speculation is that these notches were a very basic tally stick, that this was the first evidence of humans trading with each other and having a sort of a settlement day where the notches were the settlement, as they were in the tally stick, which the UK used, England used for a long, long time. So this is about 20,000 years ago. And I guess that makes sense because, humanity starts in Africa. It probably makes sense that money, which is a human invention, starts in Africa too. But then where we see money really come into its own.
Because maybe not everyone knows what a tally stick is.
A tally stick is just like a balance sheet. It's just like the IOU. So let's say Henry owes David 100 euros, and at the end of, let's say, the 1st of December, David waits for Henry. Henry produces the 100 euros, and there's a little notch in the tally stick. We say, bill paid. Okay? Right. And that actually was, I think, used very widespreadly in feudal England before the Bank of England became the thing, which was in 1694, I believe. So let's just go back. So then what you look at, you realize money emerges in something that we really understand and looks like quite modern money about 5,000 years ago in the Sumerian civilization, Mesopotamia, what is now South and Central Iraq. And something very bizarre happens. What we see is that if you trace complex societies, and this is where the basic idea came from, that about 10,000 years ago, there were 4 million humans on the earth. About 5,000 years ago, there was only 5 million. So what happened in the interim was the melting of the ice caps, was the emergence of humans beginning to settle down, the emergence of organized agriculture, the emergence of domesticated animals, which is very important in the story, and the emergence of a grounded rather than a nomadic population. Now, the fascinating thing is, for the first 5,000 years of that particular story, so 10,000 BC to 5,000 BC, the human population only rises by 1 million. From 5,000 BC to the time Jesus was chasing the moneylenders out of the temple, the human population rises to 100 million. So this is ancient demography, right? So what is happening? What you see is that in the first period, humans ended up being as much imperiled by animals as animals were by us, because the diseases of animals, cow diseases, pig diseases, basically jumped, as happened in the pandemic, jumped a species. And we didn't have the immunity. So the first 5,000 years of domesticity was a sort of a holocaust for humanity. The second 5,000 years is the time when the human immune system begins to actually learn defenses and adapt to, in an evolutionary sense, these diseases. And as a result of that, you see the population exploding. And of course, exploding populations bring their own problems, and they bring problems of complexity. So the problems of complexity are problems like, well, where do I stand? How do I value things? Is there a hierarchy? How do we organize ourselves? And that's when you see money emerging as an organizational stroke social tool, alongside or co-evolving with writing, another fantastic human technology, with numbers, with basic mathematics, with legal systems, quite complex legal systems, with organized religions, all of which are setting the rules of engagement of complicated societies. Who do I worship? What are the rules? How do I pay for things? What is the exchange, etc.? So it seems to me that money is invented by humans as a shortcut, almost, to allow us to deal with the increasing complexity of our lives, of our urban environment. And again, it's very important to point out that initially money was an urban concept, not a rural concept. So that's where the idea of social technologies like the legal system and money come in, because they basically allow us to make sense of a very complicated world. And then what you see is the Sumerians had a highly evolved notion of money based on a legal system, based on IOUs. Also, it's important to say the notion of barter never existed. This is one of the great canards that economists have foisted upon every undergraduate student, even every school student. And the amazing thing, there's no archaeological, anthropological, or any financial evidence for this.
Yeah.
So what humans were doing was much more likely, we were much more intelligent. What we were doing was exactly as this. It wasn't that Henry says, I've 2 goats, David, you've a cow, let's trade them. It was back to this basic idea that we had settlement days, right? That Henry would run up some debts over the course of 6 months. Then at 6 months' time, David would say to Henry, listen, I need a slab of silver to square this debt, or a slave or something. And so that's when money is exchanged. Now, the interesting thing about coins that you mentioned, coins do something profoundly fascinating, is that they put money in our pockets. So we move, if we can get our heads around this as economists, from trade to commerce. Now imagine that sort of movement, right? And commerce, as we know, is a much more involved, much more day-to-day, much more democratic notion. And that's where I think the coinage thing, which basically is the Lydians, has a dramatic increase in the amount of people, that's the social technology, the amount of people involved in the world of commerce.
But I suppose the thing is that obviously you can have notes, banknotes, etc., in your pocket as well, can't you? And what is sort of interesting to me is that with the usage of coins, they move, or it seems they move from not just being a signifier, an accounting mechanism, a sort of way of communicating and interacting, a sort of intermediary with, similar to tally sticks and so on, to being something that becomes, people begin to understand are valuable almost in their own right, irrespective of the social system, the social technology. I think this is the
precious,
the fundamental confusion, if you like, that leads to things like the gold standard, etc., that people begin to misunderstand money in a sense, not as a social technology, but as a valuable commodity in some sense.
Well, I think it's what's very interesting is that the Sumerians, if you go back a bit, had notions of the rate of interest. So that means that money had, by the time the Sumerians come in, had acquired a value in and of itself. Okay, because the rate of interest is the value and the price of money. So so something that initially symbolized value, okay, has actually become something of value. And then when you go to the coins, I mean, I suppose the thing is, Henry, what interests me about money is what it does to people, how it animates human progress, how it releases an energy in us. And one of the reasons it releases an energy in us is that money is a liberation. The reason we all want money is we want to be free. And the same thing was for our ancient friends. Our ancient friends were, our ancestors were living in very hierarchical societies. And suddenly or not suddenly, but over time, you introduce into those hierarchical and rigid and almost definitely caste systems, as we would know now, an element that actually signifies liberation. That a tiny modicum of social upward adjustment is possible if you are good with this stuff called money. And that, I think, is the story, the original story, which is why so many civilizations adopted it willingly.
But there seems to be, to me anyway, a distinction between a precious metal,
yes,
like that, people want gold, looks nice, it's a sort of symbol of maybe wealth, etc., and money as in coins as a social technology that relies on a whole set of relationships, and that difference seems to have been lost in that, because essentially coins are an organization, a set of rules for interaction by people, and to have the idea that you can go and then dig some stuff up somewhere miles away,
and get more of it,
and get more of it. It seems to me almost, I think I used to study philosophy, and we would call that, I think, a category error.
Well, again, what all we can do as economic historians is look back at the evidence and say why we think people were doing this. Okay. So, by the time you get to the Lydians, but particularly the Greeks, I think the Greeks are quite interesting. The Greeks are a fascinating civilization for a variety of reasons. Philosophically, I think one of the great questions is, why did the Greeks break through the glass ceiling on so many things? I mean, what was going on in that society that wasn't going on in previous societies, that wasn't going on in adjacent societies? And one of the interesting things that we know about the Greeks is they couldn't feed themselves, which is quite an extraordinary uh, achievement for an empire. Number one. Number two, as empires go, they weren't a land empire, they were a trading empire, so a rather novel concept. And as empires go, they were linked together by trading cities, by a philosophy, by a language, and a currency. This is the interesting thing. And that currency was, believe it or not, the drachma, which only disappeared off the face of the earth about 25 years ago. So what interests me about money, and to come back to your question, was that the Greeks found silver mines in a place called Laurium. And there they minted an extraordinary amount of silver over a period of time. But the question always struck me, was there a link between the fact that the Greeks were the first monetarized society that we know of in Western civilization? Was there a link between that moment and all the other advances the Greeks made in philosophy, in rationality, in Greek theatre, in art, and then, of course, in democracy, in republicanism, in the notion of citizenship? These are very radical ideas. And was there a link? And I actually believe there was. Because I think that what happens in a monetary society, as you become much more commercial, it's no surprise to me that the Greeks put the agora at the center of their cities, the marketplace, rather than the temple or rather than big wide streets for armies to run up and down. They had a sort of a bazaar was their center of their civilization. And I think that it's the liberating effect of money and also the effect of numerals. If more and more people are counting in their heads, what you move to is people thinking precisely, people thinking numerically, people thinking mathematically. And it's not a massive leap then to start thinking rationally, to think about proving things. So the monetary society is a numerate society. The numerate society tends to be a logical society, and a logical society pushes the boundaries of what is right and wrong through the notion of proof, which I presume is why they were big into geometry. So what I see are these extraordinary links, but the mercurial moment was this collective belief that the Greeks decided, which is to your question, that this little round piece of silver constituted value. And the value was something, if you think about value, it is one of the most extraordinary feats of human imagination, because what you value, Henry, and what I value might be totally different. But this little coin can sort out the differences. And that, I think, once you begin to tease these notions open, then lots of other innovations in human thinking, human organization, seem to be not just linked, but I would say they co-evolve with each other. They don't evolve directly. It's not correlation, it's not causation, but it's an interesting co-evolution of phenomena. And that, I suppose, is what the book is all about.
But there's also, I think you tell the story quite convincingly, that there've been at times a lot of misunderstandings and about money and people going down a wrong path. I mean, I think the gold standard was one, and the obsession with the gold standard, but also cryptocurrency. I mean,
Well, yes, indeed.
we have an obsession with cryptocurrency, and people just think it's, it can be created and have value, and so money. I think your point that money could be a way of, innovation, technology, and learning, but it can also be a mode for deep misunderstandings and craziness, can't it?
Well, money is complex because we are complex, right? And the story of money is complex because the story of humanity is complex. And of course, another issue is that money is social because we are social. So the reason us being social is critical is because we are a chatty ape. Okay, you and I are having a chat, we're all chatting, right? We influence each other. We tend to move collectively rather than individualistically. When it comes to money, we have these extraordinary moments of collective neurosis, mass psychological movements where after the event we say, Jesus, was I involved in that? Did I get sucked into that? Did I actually suffer from the FOMO moment that I must own Bitcoin because everybody else is owning it, right? So I think that what we have is Bitcoin, property booms, banking booms, bust, etc. What is interesting is if you go through the history of booms and busts, I was amazed that some of the finest brains at the time in the world were gullible when it came to money. So Isaac Newton's the great one, lost his shirt. There's a chapter on the South Sea Bubble, which was an episode in London and England, in effect, when the British Empire was just beginning in 1720. So you've got people like Newton losing his shirt. You have people like Darwin, the railway boom, about 120 odd years later, losing his shirt. So what you see is that great brains does not inoculate us from making mistakes with money. And I find that quite fascinating. And I think the reason we make mistakes with money is that we tend to get very excited. So in the book, I also make the point that, money can be seen like a language, that it's what makes money valuable and useful is its use, not its hoarding, its use. So the more you use a money or a form of money, the more valuable it is, which is why the dollar is extremely valuable. It's the world reserve currency because everyone uses it. So it's a wee bit like, you could say in language terms, it's a bit like the English language. So like where I am around here, just down the road, people speak Irish. Okay, this big area, they speak Irish, a lot of them. But let's say there's only 25,000 people around here. So the Irish language is useful for them, but they need to default to English once they leave this little neck of the woods. So we all default to English as the language of the world. And therefore, it's a little bit like the dollar. Now, to come to your point about Bitcoin, have you ever met anybody who speaks Esperanto, Henry?
No.
Okay, nor have I. But I have studied a bit about Esperanto. And if you meet people who are interested in Esperanto, what they will say is they are obsessive about it. They'll say it's going to replace the English language, it's going to be a new language, and they're obsessive about it, but the rest of the world, frankly, doesn't give a shit. And crypto's the same. So the crypto bros are obsessive about it. But you walk out in the street here, you ask the punters, they don't care. So I look at crypto like a lobby group. It's a very, very effective. And at the moment, as I said, I mean, the book, I wrote it, let's say it was published first in the UK in last September, before the Trump presidency. And I said, look at crypto like a lobby group. It will be like a very, very, very effective, wealthy lobby group trying to foist itself on the mainstream. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yes, particularly with Trump's sort of coins and all that.
And his sons and all that sort of stuff, yeah.
But coming back, because we started off at this question of what is money?
Yeah.
And you came down firmly on the idea it's a social technology. And we
Yes.
know that the alternative view of money is to view it more or less as a commodity.
Yes, and I think that's a very backward view.
And that's it. And so it seems to me that the cryptocurrency, it's not quite like the South Sea Bubble, which was a sort of investment project who might have made returns. It was a big risk and it all went flat. It was probably fraudulent, etc. Which is a sort of story about how you could make millions because we're going to do this, that, and the other, and everyone's going to make loads of money and you'll get a return. There's no story like that in cryptocurrency, isn't it? Because cryptocurrency is actually saying money is like a commodity. We've created it a small amount and made it totally inviolate in terms, well, they have, of course. So it seemed to me not like a investment gone wrong or getting, etc., more as based on a fundamental misunderstanding on the nature of money.
You're absolutely right. So let's go back to basic economics. There are two components of money as we know it. One is currency and one is finance. Currency is by far and away the least important part of money. Okay, it's what you have in your back pocket, or it's when you tap your phone. Digital currency can be whatever. Finance is the real alchemy of money. And finance is a historic accumulated notion of laws, of obligations, of norms, of interhuman behavior, of reputation, all those sort of things. So when you make, when you go to get your mortgage, Henry, okay, your average person gets a mortgage. What you're actually looking at is there are obligations, there's the legal system, there's things like your reputation, there are norms, there's capital accumulation, there's expectations of what you're going to do in the future. In fact, you travel in time when you take out a mortgage because you actually create this bizarre notion of an image of yourself in 30 years' time, which is, we never do that in any other way, right? And we express that through the rate of interest. So what I'm saying is that is the real magic of money. And that's what really fascinates me. As to what the standard is, whether it's gold or whether it's plastic or whether, that doesn't really interest me. And what I'm saying is that when you get bogged down in what the standard is, be it copper or gold or silver or carry beads, that's not interesting. What's interesting is finance. And that's where I believe the entire crypto notion, which is that, in some future world, governments will collapse. And only these extraordinary, foresighted men, typically men, will emerge out of some sort of post-apocalyptic chaos with a bag of Bitcoin and say, we are the future. This is like, imagine Mel Gibson and Mad Max with a bag of Bitcoin, right? That's not the future of the world. That's
And the
not the way the
irony
world
is,
works.
it's also true of gold, isn't it? That people seem to go to gold for safety, but if the world fell to bits, you can't eat gold. You can't,
Can't you? Well, this
you
this
can't,
is this is the
yeah,
Midas touch. This is the story of Midas from the Greeks, which is also in the book.
absolutely. I'm just going to move you on because there was one quite small section on modern monetary theory.
Yes, MMT. Yes.
Yeah, and I was surprised, I suppose, by its brevity, because I mean, in the debates about money, etc., it seems to me, anyway, as an observer, that modern monetary theory has made a big splash, and obviously is incredibly controversial. I mean, a lot of the big guns of mainstream economics have spent relatively amount of money shooting it down and saying it's nonsense, whereas most heterodox economics gets ignored by the mainstream as a
Yeah.
general rule. So I wonder, why was modern monetary theory so controversial? Why did it get the attention from the ex Nobel
Yeah.
Prize winners, etc., because it was deemed something that was so dangerous as an idea that they had to put effort into killing it.
I think one of the main proponents of MMT is a very, very old friend of mine, a very good economist called Stephanie Kelton. And Stephanie Kelton wrote the book The Deficit Myth, which is the sort of Bible of MMT. And I think during the pandemic, MMT made an enormous amount of monetary, financial, but social and political sense. So and this is when MMT had its moment, you might remember, it was during the pandemic. So if you remember what happened in the pandemic, uh, Irish government, British government, American government says you guys can't go to work. You basically can't earn an income. And people said, oh, okay, fair enough. A lot of people got fed up, but said okay. And then they realized, well, if we prevent people from having an income, we need in some way to give them money. Otherwise, you're going to get an insurrection. So they came up with this idea, well, look, don't worry about it. We just print the stuff. So the central bank, together with the Treasury, the 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 central bank, the Bank of England, will just tacitly understand that it'll accept treasuries from number 11 Downing Street, and in return, it'll give money to number 11 Downing Street, and then number 11 Downing Street will drop that money over the society, which was Keynes and Hayek both agreed on, called helicopter money. In the event of a massive liquidity trap, they never mentioned a pandemic, but there we have it, right? And therefore, modern monetary theory seems to be kind of the logical extension of that. That if you can just give people money in a pandemic, why can't you just give them money all the time, right? And this, I suppose, was the sort of eureka moment that people said, whoa, that makes complete sense. I think one of my issues with modern MMT is the role of the rate of interest. I think that if the state prints money uh, in return for treasuries, even if there is a massive output gap, so let's get all economic about it, and there is no inflation for a while, one dilemma is what happens to the rate of interest, the role of the financial system? Because the rate of interest does a lot of things that we don't really look at, we don't really consider. There's a huge amount of information in it, etc. But what it does do is it willingly coaxes money from people who don't want to spend. And willingly is the word, is important, gives at a price that money to people who actually want to spend or invest. Therefore, the rate of interest should always be positive. And the reason it should always be positive is because a positive rate of interest puts a value on money, to go back to our initial conversation. If the state is printing money without reference to a rate of interest, and if the state is creating a rate of interest and engineering a rate of interest, what it will do is it will gum up that lovely part of money that we called finance that we spoke about a minute ago, Henry. So in a way, MMT is all about currency, but money, in my book, is a combination of currency and finance. And finance rests on the rate of interest, which is the price of money or the value of money. And you can interfere with that in the short term because of, for example, a pandemic. And you can say, look, guys, we're going to drop the rate of interest to zero simply because we have an epidemic going on. But once normal conditions emerge, I tend to take the rather Keynesian view, which is that what is the pragmatic solution to where we are now? And the pragmatic solution to where we are now is to go back to where we were before the pandemic, which is a reasonably well-organized, well-functioning financial system, which has warts and all, no doubt, and we can iron out some of the cracks. But I don't necessarily believe that MMT and that part of money called finance could coexist together for very long.
Well, I suppose I had a different understanding of MMT in that, well, I think in my view anyway, as I see it, MMT maybe it's divided between its sort of policy prescriptions and
Yes.
it's trying to describe how the money and finance system work.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. And I think from a policy perspective, what is interesting about MMT, and we should be all aware of that in mature democracies that have existing legal system and financial systems and fiscal policy, is the scope for government spending is more larger than we think it is. And the knee-jerk reversion to austerity, which your viewers in the United Kingdom will be well aware of, because it seems to me from over here in Ireland, you've been in austerity since about 2008, and your Labour Party is terrorised by anything that doesn't seem to have austerity written into it. The scope for spending, government spending, is clearly greater. However, the United Kingdom also had the Liz Truss moment, which is the scope for government spending on the right things could be greater, but as a carte blanche, as an open checkbook to a government, the financial markets will still, through the rate of interest on the long term, UK gilt will still dictate what is possible and what is irresponsible. So I think, in fact, the UK had an interesting experiment in a type of MMT over the last 5 years. And I think it was quite a pragmatic and realistic lesson. The United States at the moment is, in effect, expanding government balance sheet through Mr. Trump's big, beautiful budget, the limits of which, again, are exposed at the long end of the curve. Because if you think about, long-term interest rates are only short-term interest rates with a risk premium. Short-term interest rates the central bank can fix, but it can't fix the risk premium. And so I think that's the important part to keep juggling with this. And again, I come back to the idea, MMT is a very interesting intellectual idea. I think they are right in the way in which they see money being created. I've described it in the book as push versus pull. So, for example, typically what we teach in economics and monetary economics in university, what most economists learn, which most economists think, and what most central bankers think, is that money is kind of created in the central bank and pushed into the system by the central bank, by an all-knowing central banker. That's not the way it works. Actually, what actually happens is the central bank is pulled around by the commercial banks who actually create money. And they create money in response to a demand for money, which is, again, comes from humans. So I think MMT finds its place in that story somewhere. But as you know, I'm much more likely to alight on the position where if something seems too magical, it probably is.
But then, I mean, the truth is, but wasn't it during the crash? How did I think in the US, the Federal Reserve was asked, how did they move the money, whether it was just an entry in a spreadsheet. And I suppose, but it's what I think seems to me is MMT is that it does see it as a social technology and the rules and the, not as a we're short of money, sort of as a sort of commodity you can be short of. But I wanted to pick up lastly on your point about the US and the current situation, because yes, as you were saying, I think the long-term Treasury interest rates are looking dicey, and people are writing about whether there is effectively an exit from dollars, but there's a question of where do you go? Do you go to Swiss franc or wherever else, or what could be the alternative currency? I mean, where do you see that? I mean, what do you think is driving this? Because I suppose the real moment was the Liberation Day, wasn't it? That started the bond market looking dicey, and it suggested that was the reason why Trump pulled back, but it hasn't helped. Is that right?
Well, I think that because money is ephemeral, because it is a product of the human imagination, because one of the most extraordinary things about money is it's not real. It's real because we will it to exist. It's like faith. If you're a believing Catholic, you believe, for example, and the people going to mass here probably believe that the really fundamentalist ones will believe that yes, indeed, the host is the body of Christ. So these are so in a way, religion gives us a template for what money is, and that's based,
Or
I
even
think,
magic.
yeah, and money is kind of magic in a way, but it's based on trust. That's the essential idea. Okay, that do you trust the people who are issuing the currency? Do you trust the piece of paper? Do you trust the zeros in your bank account? All those sort of things, right? Now, if you are a state begins to undermine that trust, either for real or transparent reasons, then it begins to chip away at something fundamental. So I'll give you the great example is when our grandparents were children in this part of the world, sterling was the reserve currency of the world. 80% of all international trade was financed out of London. There was a reason when I was a kid, if somebody played well in a football match, it was described as a sterling performance. He played well, he did a sterling performance, because the perception was that sterling was the standard. And then Britain stumbles into the First World War, fights the First World War, goes from being a net creditor, and the global creditor, to a net debtor. The Americans emerge, and what really was the canary in the coal mine from that shift in global power from London to New York was sterling. So you get, after the First World War, intermittent sterling crises. You have people like Winston Churchill, who was lamentably ignorant of economics, fighting with Keynes, who was extraordinarily conversant in economics, over the issue of sterling, its value, etc. But basically what happened was the world had shifted away from the UK. And gradually then over time, as we know the history of the last 100 years. I think that's the background noise to people's anxiety about the United States. That the globe is shifting away from America towards Asia. Tariffs are, of course, symptomatic of that fear. You know, self-confident countries don't impose tariffs, okay? As a general rule, self-confident countries say, bring it on, we'll trade our way out of this. And then you put on top of that this enormous budget deficit that they have now. They have a debt GDP ratio of about 100%. So give or take, because when you're talking trillions, a few billions don't mind. Let's say they have about $32 trillion economy
But
and about
this
a
has grown
$32 trillion debt. And when you
this has
just
grown.
when the rate of interest, which is 5% now, is greater than the growth rate, which is 2%, if the quantum of debt is 100%, you start going into this vortex where the mathematics just don't make sense. And I think that that's really what's happening. So it's a general anxiety and then the bad behavior of this particular administration is undermining the dollar.
But what I was going to say was that this growth in debt dates back to Reagan, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It does. It dates back. I mean,
it's amazing that it's been going for so long, and it's only now suddenly everyone's worried about it.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, at least I think there were various people in the know who were talking about it for some time, but suddenly it seems to have got to a stage. I mean, that I suppose is Trump, but Trump suddenly said, look, this can't go on.
Or people looked at Trump and said, this can't go on, in the sense that, you know, if you have a system where the Federal Reserve remains in control and the Federal Reserve is populated by adult people, then you think, well, you know what? The Americans will recalibrate. They might have a fiscal crisis, but they will recalibrate and they'll go back onto a path that we know and understand, and they will lead the world monetarily. If you think the Federal Reserve is going to be punctured and policed and populated by Trump's MAGA supporters over the course of the next 4 years, then everything is up for grabs. My own feeling is that the Trump presidency will end in some sort of fiscal stroke dollar crisis. And that will actually frame the next administration in the United States. And the next administration in the United States will try to tidy up what has been left untidy by this administration. So I think that, and that's why I suppose it's quite interesting. You write a book about money. It's relevant consistently because money is consistently an anxiety that humans have. And I do think that's where we're going, that the United States will have a fiscal crisis. The rate of interest will rise. Trump will try to interfere with a patsy in the Federal Reserve. That will cause less confidence. There'll be a split between Wall Street and Main Street. And what you will get is an end of a presidency that will look very untidy financially and fiscally.
Well, I think that's a good point to start. You've told us the future, and we will look to see with interest whether it happens. A lot of economists often regret these sort of predictions, but we'll
that's
see
what we're here for. You've got to go for it. You know, you can't just say on the one hand, on the other hand, you've got to say, over the years, I've looked at these things. This is the way I think it's going to go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much,
Henry.
David.
Great stuff, Henry. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.